hopefully while I'm giving my introduction. It's a particular pleasure to introduce Dr. Scott Harris here at Penn. You know from his bio that we're in the presence of a very distinguished individual who has worked for many years in areas that we care about around education, child development, assessment, and also with international perspectives, which he'll be talking about at least part of his talk today, which is on global trends on education and assessment. The official bio, which I'm going to also give you a less official one in a moment, but the official bio says that he has been Vice President of Research in Research and Development Division of Educational Testing Service since 2011, which is in Princeton, New Jersey, as I think you all know. And he has been responsible for overall leadership and direction for assessment research and capacity development at ETS. And it says also that he served as head of the Center for Research and Pedagogy and Practice at the National Institute of Education in Singapore, where I had the pleasure of seeing him at least once in his role there in Singapore. Before that, and where we got to know each other both for areas of common interest and because we both share a long-standing relationship with the University of Michigan. He was a professor of both psychology and education at the University of Michigan. I'm going to guess for at least 20 years, maybe
30.
30 years. Doesn't look that old. But okay, 30 years. And as I was Googling to try to say relevant details of his background, I hadn't realized that he was several times a winner of various teaching awards at the University of Michigan. And having visited him in his teaching, I can vouch for what a great teacher he is, something that maybe at some point, maybe later in the day, I'll have to ask what it's like being at ETS where you don't get to do that kind of function, or at least not the obvious professorial function. So let us give a hand for Scott.
I'll go. Well, thank you very much. What I want to try and do is simply get to the present day and say that we are in an interconnected global world. For better or worse, there's lots of things that come with that. We know instantly now by phone the news in Hong Kong, the news in Liberia. We are connected, and that has positive and negative consequences. I think the negative consequence for me is that we're finding out that economics is a zero-sum game, but fortunately education isn't. So in this particular day and age, I think globalization is having very positive impact on educational growth, and I'm going to try and bring out some of those trends. Dan asked me to identify global trends, and I wanted to talk to you about what ETS is doing, so I'm going to sneak my agenda into his agenda, and I'll tell you about global trends that I see, but from a fairly egocentric point of view. I found this quote to be a telling place to start, and that is, we are focused on human capital, and human capital really drives education in the workplace. And whether we like it or not in higher education, it is the engine now that provides the warrants for a lot of the reforms and the movements. And the logic goes something like this. Workers lack the skills they need. Employers want better education, so they don't have to pay the training costs. Policymakers want higher educational standards, including more rigorous tests, better teachers. And the overall goal is to increase human capital so that we can promote economic success and nation building. Education is part of that. And I tried to draw out what I thought were some of the implications for education, and you can recognize these in a lot of the millennial goals and other things. But I think when you look at human capital as the driver for education today, it results in a better global press for education for everyone, particularly for marginalized groups, particularly in underdeveloped countries. But we can look in America, we can look in Philadelphia, and the press is better education for the entire population. So a press for educational opportunity as well as educational quality. An extended education, I don't know why we're so slow to get to universal preschool, but we'll get there eventually. And we're going to have education over a longer age span to increase human capital. We'll have deeper learning is the phrase that's caught on now internationally. Dan talked in his book about the quality of learning being emphasized at least since the Jomtien conference in 1990. We're going to have technology-based education. Whether you look at it from an economic point of view, the marketplace is rife with opportunity for people to make money. It's also a tremendous opportunity to aid teachers and students in new ways to have blended learning and better educational opportunities. I'll talk about that. We certainly need better trained teachers, and I stuck in here new pedagogies because I did want to say that I think one of the presses to increase human capital is to increase the talents, the abilities of teachers. And teachers in this technology-based world are going to need to invent new pedagogies. And all of us who grew up without blended learning, virtual reality, simulated environments, and some of the newer pedagogies are probably less equipped to teach people how to use these than some of the younger people that are actually learning with these methods. But we're going to have to figure out new pedagogies around the world that capitalize on the technologies. And then finally, I wanted to acknowledge the bridges to the workforce. I think more and more we're getting the press in K-12 education and post-secondary education to provide training for the workforce. Now, at least 40, 50 years ago, that wasn't the warrant. Education in itself was a noble goal. And at least those in the academy, I think, have a certain kind of antipathy towards the commercialization of education, and we don't like to think of university as vocational training, but economists do. And so we have to think of the bridges to the workforce from an economic and an educational perspective. So here's my first of 10 very fast global trends, and then you can go into more depth if you'd like. So the global comparative assessments that you're all familiar with, like PISA and TALIS, TIMSS, PEARLS, et cetera, are going to proliferate. They're very popular. They're popular with policymakers, economists, politicians. I just gave you a quick example about PISA. The interesting thing is that in PISA, ETS was able to provide an adaptive testing framework with spiraled items, so each test taker didn't have the full complement of items. They're represented across test takers. So our methods of testing, our methods of sampling, our methods of test administration are really more sophisticated than they were 10 years ago and represented in the PISA and also in the PIAC. And the PIAC is a little more recent. It's the adult competency, and the results have just been coming out in the last year, but OECD and ETS teamed together to produce, again, a multi-stage adaptive testing on computers in 24 countries around the world. And we tried to be innovative in the sampling techniques, which are critical for global kinds of comparative assessments, as well as the analytical methods. I was going to say a little more about the PIAC, but I think I'll just skip it. I picked out one representative graph. All these are available in public websites, OECD websites. The thing that I liked about this was one of the graphs measuring income inequality, so low income inequality to high income inequality, and skills, low skills inequality to high skills inequality. And interestingly enough, the US is high on income and skill inequality. So our variance is spread out and we're high on both. Doesn't mean quality, but it means the differences between the top and bottom in terms of literacy proficiency and the top and bottom in terms of income. Interestingly enough, Russia has a very high income inequality, but not as much skills inequality. And then you can see outliers. Japan has sort of average average income inequality, but very low skills inequality. So interesting kinds of comparisons that that are interpreted from the data. And I think one of the reasons that we're going to see the continuation of global comparative studies like this are these reasons. It's a huge data resource. There's a lot of dissertations in here. There's a lot of conference papers. But there's a lot of fodder for policymakers to try and compare the background characteristics of the test takers with the institutional aspects of education in different countries. They also provide benchmarks for growth. When I was in Singapore, I was a little bit astounded, but when the PISA and the TIMSS tests came out, the people in the ministry went through the test item by item to identify which items were most difficult for students in Singapore, and those items were in the curriculum the next year. Those items or concepts. So they have the tests have a direct impact on many ministries of education who use them for guidance about what their students should know at a higher level than they demonstrate. I think it can lead to imitation and adoption of educational practices. There are so many trips to Finland and Singapore to find out the magic that leads them to be high scorers on these tests. I think this is a really interesting discussion of why you can't import culture piecemeal. But educators seem to be bent on trying to adopt individual strands of successful countries. Interesting discussion if you'd like later. We can have comparisons within countries and within subgroups with the data collected within the different jurisdictions because it leads to interesting ideas for policymakers, certainly urban-rural kinds of differences, but even within subgroups within a country, if you find groups not making progress who you expect to make progress, it can lead to new policy. But basically, we're relying more on evidence-based, data-based decision-making for new policies and practices. And I think that's one of the consequences of this global trend for comparative data. The second data trend I want to talk about is really the assessments of workforce. And we tend to think of K-16, K-20 education when we're in the academy, but I'm turning at ETS more and more to an understanding of the importance of the transition from higher education to workforce. And interestingly, OECD and I think economies around the world are looking at that more. So we want to look for readiness for work. We want to look at the employee selection and the job fit, transition to work, skill development during work, and the ability for assessments, whether by a ministry or ETS or the government, to establish standards and benchmarks for individual success. Now, the international context that provides the motivation for this, again, is the PIAC survey that shows the U.S. continues to fall behind other countries in terms of workplace skill competencies. The PIAC results showed us in the middle of the pack, and Americans always like to feel that there's some kind of interpretation of the poor performance in the international test that somehow exonerates us from change. But the fact that we're not doing well in a lot of the workplace skills that traditionally we have done well, I think is a signal that we need to do better. So we need to look at European Commission and ONET in America and other places to look at job classifications and the critical dimensions of job success. If you want to think of the talent pipeline from education into either low-skilled jobs, technical schools, or post-secondary, we have several opportunities to have some assessments and training built in here. So we're beginning to identify assessments of students' habits, of their interests, of their particular talents to try and figure out what kind of career they're most suited for. We also then identify obstacles to success, and we're developing some assessments, one called Success Navigator, that we can give to college students that identifies social support, motivation, work habits, study habits, things that maybe are obstacles to students being successful in school. We're using this with a lot of community colleges right now, where students who are either part-time students or first-generation college students may not have the study skills and the social supports to excel at a university setting. So we're trying to identify obstacles here, and then we're trying to build tools for workforce competencies, the kinds of things that people talk about as 21st century skills. But at ETS, which is usually considered an educational testing company, we're moving into this transition to the workforce because we think it's important for our mission, and that is the educational opportunity, equity, and success of students around the world. And so assessments that help us identify and nurture skills in this kind of a pipeline are important for us. I'm going to skip through some of this. This is the important point I wanted to say is it's an evidence-based system, and we're building on either American or European kinds of classification for the knowledge, skills, and abilities that are needed for different kinds of jobs. And the model that we're developing at ETS is called a stackable credential model. The idea is that once you get out of college or you get out of high school, you're going to want to add credentials that show your skills and competencies. This fits in very much with the competency-based education movement that says, I have these badges, I have these certificates, I pass these courses, and so you stack your credentials, and when you go to an employer, you say, I've done these things, I have these skills and abilities. And that, we think, is going to lead to a better selection and a better match between candidates and jobs. Some of our scientists have tried to identify this in terms of job requirements and indicators of success, and of course it starts to line up with the assessments that we want to build. So intrapersonal and interpersonal, soft skill, non-cognitive kinds of assessments are one of the things that we do at ETS, and if we can go ahead and build new assessments for workplace that demonstrates responsibility, teamwork, integrity, and so on, we think that can be a real advantage to the employer and the employee. I'll just say a quick word. One of the things we're doing here, I mentioned to a few people earlier, is we're developing some new methods. And so one of those methods is using forced choice assessments of non-cognitive variables. Instead of Likert ratings, which ask how much you agree or disagree, or how much this is like you or not like you, which are easily fakeable for social desirability, we're using a new method that basically asks, would you like to do A or B? Are you more like A or B? So I ask you, are you a responsible person or are you a sociable person? There's not a clear right answer, but as you make these choices across a large number of items, we get to see your responses on things like responsibility. And if you choose to indicate that responsibility is one of your core features, that comes out in this sort of multidimensional space. So again, the thing that I think is important is there's a global trend to measuring workforce. There's a global trend to invent new methodologies, and ETS at least is trying to present some of those. This is an overview of the basic evidence-based model's goals. We want to have assessments that help us select new hires, and you can see an analogy to higher education. We want to select new students. We want workforce development building skills. We want academic skills. And we want common standards and portability. You want an end goal of having standards you can add to these stackable credentials and say, I have these things and they're portable. I can take them to different colleges or jobs. Okay? This is my transition to the third global trend that I wanted to talk about, and that is the emphasis on student learning outcomes. Now, I taught at the University of Michigan for 30 years, and actually, if you'd asked me about this 20 years ago, I think I would have had some disdain for this whole idea. Students at Michigan demonstrate their competence in their courses every day. We don't need an additional measure of a student learning outcome. You have a degree from Michigan, we know what it stands for. it turns out that not everyone agrees with that, and so the Spellings Commission in 2005 said, we want more accountability. We want more visible indicators of what you have besides a degree and a GPA. So the notion is, and it's still untested, that we can provide student learning outcome measures that can be used to add value to your GPA and major, that allow analyses of growth. For example, we're working with the University of North Carolina, and the state legislature is asking, how much do you gain by going to college for 4 years in North Carolina? Because some of the conclusions, such as academically adrift, say there's no growth. The kids come out at 21 or 2, the same way they went in at 18. We allow comparisons among higher education institutions, and this should promote some fear among people because higher ed places don't like to be compared or ranked usually. But if we think of who benefits from these comparisons, it's usually people below the midpoint. So the University of Phoenix would love to have student learning outcome measures that they could compare. And they would love to show that some of their students score as well as the students from Penn or Princeton. It's to their advantage. And we want to be able to connect higher education training with career readiness. So have you talked about student learning outcomes at all for higher education in any of your classes? Relatively new topic. Okay. There is going to be more emphasis on this, but it's going to be a question whether there's an uptake in higher ed for it. The appetite is not necessarily at the top tier schools. So where does the pressure come from? It comes from business employers because they want comparable portable credentials that give more information than just a major and a GPA. Very much like the tuning project in Europe that is trying to get some uniform set of exit credentials. So if you go to a university in Europe, they want to be able to say you have these skills or abilities. We know that the competency-based education, and again, that's more of the Western governors and the University of Phoenix, they want exit exams to show that virtual university students have the skills that other people do. And then we get financial institutions, the Sallie Mae's and people that have a vested interest in having more student loans, more rigorous standards to reduce business costs. So there's a lot of different pressures for student learning outcomes, not really from higher ed or from faculty or from students. The Lumina Foundation, for example, has the degree qualifications profile, and they're saying these 5 kinds of evidence when you exit a university or a post-secondary institution should be assessed and then compared. So you can imagine if every graduate of Penn was asked to take an assessment on these 5 skills, and that it would be compared to every other university graduate in Pennsylvania and perhaps elsewhere. We do have some generic student learning outcomes already. ETS has something called the proficiency profile, not used that widely. Collegiate learning assessment, again, a relatively boutique kind of a product, and the collegiate assessment of academic proficiency. The notion is that they are assessing general academic skills and not curriculum content. Why? So they can see if your 4 years at the university added intellectual value to your own development. Okay? So it's interesting motivation. You have a question?
Yeah, where do you see the revenue stream coming from? Is this something that students are paying for because they want to earn that credential with an employer?
Okay, we're going to hold because we're pressed for time.
Oh.
Keep your question.
Okay, but it's a great question. I'll answer it quickly, but I understand Dan's caveat. The revenue stream is unclear. People think that the students will pay for it because they see an advantage for either entrance to graduate programs or entrance to the workplace. Untested, but it's a great question. Let's see. Let me just skip that and go right to, these are some of the dimensions that have been suggested for student learning outcomes, besides language proficiency, mathematics, critical reasoning, and so on. So these were identified in a meta-analysis at ETS. Creativity, critical thinking, teamwork, effective communication, digital information literacy, citizenship and life skills. And it's interesting that there's a lot of debate about these. So when we went to the University of North Carolina, who is a partner in us doing a pilot test of this, there was almost universal acceptance of something like critical thinking. Universal skepticism that we could measure creativity in a way that would be fair across students at the university. Some reluctance to think that citizenship and life skills should be highly valued as student learning outcomes. So people have different value judgments about what should be assessed as a student learning outcome and what should count. And that's going to, as much as the revenue stream, that's going to be a critical debate. At the University of North Carolina, they're actually under political pressure to show that the 25 regional campuses around the state provide good value. They don't have to be equal value, but provide good value for students. So if you're at a regional campus and not Chapel Hill, do you still get a value for your 4-year investment? And that's becoming a political, economic question that people want answered. They feel it's accountability of higher ed to the funding agencies, although the states don't provide that much funding anymore. So quickly, the consequences: they allow comparisons, which has advantages and disadvantages. They provide higher ed institutions with evidence about student learning and growth, and they provide public evidence about the return of investment and value, which was Margaret Spelling's commission 10 years ago, demanding higher ed be more accountable. So I think it's going to be a global trend, not just a US trend. I think in Australia you see the same thing. Even in China and India, there's a little bit more skepticism that attendance is an adequate marker for achievement. And so they want additional data that says, I spent the years and I have these skills. And it fits very well with the stackable credential model and the transition from higher ed to workforce. So in some ways, if you stand back, what I'm suggesting is the global trend is merging educational training and development with workforce preparation. And those are almost going to be seamless in the future. Whether you see that as commercialization of education or earlier training for the workforce, they're going to be, I think, more connected. The fourth trend, more assessments of English language proficiency. And Yuko knows this, and she's one of our key advisors on the Committee of Examiners for the TOEFL. And we're going to have a wider set of age ranges assessed. We're going to have academic language and workplace literacy. We're going to have assessments of teachers who teach English. All you have to do is think about all those college students at 21 wandering around Southeast Asia teaching English for 6 weeks or 3 months. I met an Irish kid and a Scottish kid teaching English in southern Thailand. I couldn't understand their English accents. I have no idea what the Thai kids did with it. But we're going to have a global English emphasis, partly because it's the lingua franca of global business. Singapore is a good example. Country took a huge bet in 1965 and banking on education and business based on English language in an Asian setting. We have global efforts to improve English language. Japan under Abe has a huge shift to having greater English fluency among all workers. The ASEAN nations committed to 2015 benchmarks of English success. The BRICS countries certainly have a vested interest. Again, economics drive education, drive global English. And the commercial marketplace, the estimates are $7 or $8 billion per year in global English learning. At ETS, in the last few years, we've expanded the age range and added tests for 8 to 11-year-olds, 11 to 15-year-olds, institutional tests for students, and then the TOEFL IBT, which some of you probably took, and I appreciate you not throwing anything at me, but the TOEFL test is still considered one of the standards for English proficiency, and we use it for admissions to universities, also used for visas and immigration. We're undergoing enhancements on this. We actually have a 5-year research agenda to consider all of the changes to our global English assessments And just to foreshadow that, the trend is not just to assess, but to couple it with teaching. So there's going to be more emphasis on not just assessing English language, but connecting it to productive teaching, so more formative assessment. The fifth global trend, I want to say something about K-12. So we're going to have more rigorous content, technology-based assessments in K-12, probably more frequent and more expensive tests, but that's where the public fights back. The culminating assessments at secondary school, I think, will remain the gateways. This is the primary use of assessment globally, is that there are not enough seats in higher education. You need a filter, you take a test. And that's true in virtually every country in the world. I think grades 3 to 8 around the world are going to focus more and more on formative assessment, except for the gateway assessments, usually grade 5 or 6. In Singapore, it's the PSLE, Pupil School Leaving Exam. The end of primary usually has a gateway exit test in virtually every country in the world, and that tracks you to an academic or a vocational kind of orientation. So I should have put that in. That's function will remain. K-2 assessments are going to become more prominent despite parents and early childhood educators, but they hopefully will remain formative. Okay, so the secondary exit, post-secondary entry, SAT, ACT, Gaokao, A-levels, around the world, they're going to stay important. They're going to make slow, glacially slow movements to become more content-based, perhaps more curriculum-based, and certainly more standards-based. So the new SAT that's coming out next year, that David Coleman is shaping, is supposed to be a culminating high school exam. He's the architect of the Common Core. If you learn the Common Core to a high level, you should do well on the new SAT. You don't need to take you should take the grade 12 high school exit exam. You won't need to take the SAT. They're going to become redundant. So his long-term vision is that the SAT and the ACT would be replaced by your culminating exam at high school if it shows that you've mastered the curriculum. So that's an important change. Whether or not that'll happen, I don't know. We're going to focus more on performance than recall. You can Google any fact in the world, and kids, if you let them use their phones in class, they're smarter than all of us anyway. So we're going to move all the assessments to performance-based demonstrations of what you can do with facts. So procedures, metacognition, conceptual explanations, identifying obstacles and remediation of those obstacles, much more common now than, do you remember, the capital of Illinois? So we're also going to have a focus on 21st century learning skills. As you know, in the United States, we've got the consortia, the Parkin Smarter Balance, designing new assessments in English language arts, math, and science. We have ACT with a new K-12 commercial system called Aspire. Everything is up for grabs because 2015 is supposed to be implementation of the new assessments. The states are resisting. They're leaving Parkin Smarter Balance. They're getting increasing pressure from people who don't understand the Common Core but are resistant to changes in the assessment without adequate time to change the curriculum and prepare teachers and students for it. So I'm not sure how things are going to work out. The political forces are pretty strong. There's also some huge economic forces here. So the big companies tend to get, the big vendors tend to get the big contracts, and whether it's for technology and hardware or for assessment, Pearson's under increasing criticism, Amplify, Google, I mean, all the technology providers are at risk for states being unsure whether they really want to do this. Formative assessments will increase because they're lower stakes. The trouble is that formative assessments require so much more knowledge and skill from teachers because teachers have to diagnose students' misconceptions, their point of development in learning progressions. They have to be instantly smart about the learning paths of 30 kids in the classroom. Very difficult. So the question is, can technology help that? Can we connect technology with learning, instruction, grouping, individualized instruction. I think that's a reasonable aspiration and some way that we can really use assessment to help teachers and kids. Save teachers time, provide a technological assistance for students, part of the blended learning, so you can take assessments at home or on your phone or somewhere else. Teachers can have access to the data. And if it frees teachers time to work with kids, I think it can be a significant advantage. Now, in an undeveloped country without technological resources, this might be 20 years away. But I think it's a global trend because we simply don't have enough teachers, qualified teachers, who have enough time to give kids the attention they each need. K-2 assessments hopefully will stay formative. They'll get to be what Dan's called smaller, cheaper, quicker, because you're looking for basic skills. Can you count to 10? Can you read this sentence? Can you demonstrate proficiency at a basic level? I think they're going to be the beginning of academic standards for primary grades around the world. And we really don't have any global standards for early childhood education and primary grades. The reason I like them is that they're dependent on teachers and they're student-centered. So they're contextualized for the student and the teacher. So formative assessment, I don't think will ever be a big economic market, but it'll be a terrific educational opportunity for teachers to use their knowledge of kids to shape the curriculum and their pedagogy to help them. So for me, this is a good model of how we can use assessment to really help teachers and students, even when there's probably no revenue stream. So the consequences of this trend, I think we're going to have national standards for early childhood. I think the standards are going to lead to benchmark summative assessments. That's the whole reason for the consortia, Parkins Smarter Balance. The danger is the assessments can also be used for other purposes. So if you use value-added measures to evaluate teachers, I think it's a huge risk. I would like ETS to take a stand and say that these have such serious limitations that we shouldn't use standardized test scores for evaluating teachers. A lot of people agree, but it's a very sensitive political position to take. So we continue to do the research on it, but we're sensitive, and so far we have not endorsed value-added measures on a wide scale. Assessments may narrow the curricula and the time can be deflected from instruction. These are the public's concerns, and I think they're legitimate. And so as a testing company who's committed to help kids and teachers, I think we are very sensitive to these potential collateral damage, as Berliner calls it, to the kids and teachers. Okay, global trend 6. Boy, I'm not sure I can talk faster. Can I have 10 minutes? If I finish in 10 minutes, or?
Perfect.
Yep, okay. Faster. So global trend 6, collaborative problem solving and teamwork, part of the 21st century learning skills. It's part of the focus in a lot of policymakers. It's emphasized in PISA 2015 and 2018. It includes a lot of new competencies, but we are just developing the definitions and the methods to study it. So imagine how you'd assess collaboration. A few people around a table, different people on Skype, different ways of doing it. I just tried to schematically show we can have human-to-human kinds of analyses through observation. We can do chat boxes on remote people collaborating remotely. We can have immersive virtual environments. People can contribute to solving a problem in a virtual environment with remote chat boxes or a Skype-like environment. We've got some studies going on where we have a Skype task and we have a moderator, and we're looking at oral communication as well as collaboration and problem solving. So we're trying to invent some new methodologies that people can use, because the PISA 2015 will be a wake-up call for a lot of governments to say, well, we don't really have an agenda for assessing or teaching collaboration, but now it's an important skill. What are we going to do? We're trying to be a step ahead of that so we can have some suggestions. Here's how you might train it, here's how you might test it, with the idea of promoting more teamwork within schools and the workplace. I can talk about it later if you'd like. So the seventh trend, technology-based assessments will continue to proliferate. We talk about taking an assessment anywhere, anytime. My vision is 10 years from now, a kid is on the MRT in Hong Kong or Singapore. They ring up a website on the phone. They have a little voice. You want to take assessment number 17? Yes. Okay. And then plugged in, and they take assessment 17 either by manual responses or by speech. 2 minutes later, they click end or finish, and about 60 seconds later, they get some feedback. That's where I'd like to go. I want to have anywhere, anytime assessment. I want to have the scoring of written and spoken responses scored as much as possible by computer, and I want immediate feedback. When feedback is immediate, all tests are formative. You take the GRE and find out 10 minutes later how you did on it, you're going to sign up for another one or not, right? So I try to tell people at ETS, nobody would buy our test in the shopping mall. They take them because they have to. So what we want to do is turn them into formative devices so they become learning, not bars that you fail at, but bars that you get to and then everyone can succeed. Our automated scoring, we have more than 15 years of research, and we can score essays. In fact, we do already score for the GRE and the TOEFL. We score essays with our software engines. We can do constructed response, some forms of spontaneous speech within highly constrained domains, mathematical expressions, and if anybody's used Turnitin, they run our software engine to detect plagiarism. Also, every journal editor around the world uses some type of plagiarism detection that's basically the same kind of software we have. The global trend 8 is, and this is my own bias, is the assessments in the future will be based more on conversations than on paper and pencil. So in 10 years, I don't think anybody will remember a Scantron any more than a phone booth. Okay? You won't even have the words bubble in the vocabulary anymore, because it's going to be like Siri. There will be the capability to converse with agents or humans, and your knowledge will be transmitted. So instead of asking what's the capital of Illinois, they might say, tell me something about how early settlements in Illinois led to the relocation of the capital around the state, which is a little more difficult, why it wasn't Chicago and why it wasn't, well, Springfield and so on. So explanations and conversations, I think, are going to be much more prevalent in future examinations. We're going to have explanations from teachers and students. We're going to have English language learning. We're going to have conversations with people and avatars. We're working with Art Grazer and his group on a process called trialogues, where basically the test taker is engaged in a three-way conversation with two avatars in a simulated environment. So for an English language learner, it can be two people in a market and they want to buy something, and the conversation goes back and forth. It pulls in the test taker. For a classroom, it can be a teacher and a student avatar in a classroom, pulls in the test taker to say, can you explain that? Was that right? How would you explain it to them? So the test taker is pulled into explaining or conversing with virtual characters. Oh yeah, we're also doing a teacher licensure where in fact we're asking future teachers to have a conversation, and again with avatars, to basically explain a student's performance or explain things to the students. Global Trend 9, the gamification of education. We produce SimCity and ArguBots, and you can look on our website, but along with GlassLab and University of Maryland and a few other groups, we are moving toward making assessments engaging but more game-like. Interesting, some differences there, but this is more like problem-solving SimCity. Actually, here's And so we give them the environment, and then they have problems about air pollution or rainwater or something that they need to solve within the parameters defined. We also have simulations, and so we actually now have formative assessments where you can virtually pour one chemical to another, where you can manipulate one action to another, where you can decide to place seismometers on a volcano in different patterns. So we're moving more towards the performance, but we're using simulations to promote it. The 10th trend is that we're going to have more multimodal assessments and more interactive assessments. So we're already doing research using Connect-like technology to get the gestures, the facial expressions of people, so that when you take a TOEFL or a TOEIC exam in the future, we'll not only have your English language intonation, fluency, prosody, we'll have your face for facial recognition with a bank of all your national identity cards. We'll also have your voice biometrics, so we'll do voice identification that we can confirm on multiple ways. We can do sentiment analysis, non-cognitive analysis, personality analysis of your engagement, of your attention, of your gaze. Scary, isn't it? The idea is, what kinds of additional data can we collect and analyze from a test taker that might be useful to know? If I'm trying to measure English language communication proficiency, it might be interesting to know if you look at the person or not. It might be interesting to know if you pause occasionally. So there are lots of linguistic devices that cannot be gamed or memorized, as so many students do now, that are important for communication. And we're trying to figure out ways that we can collect that. We certainly are going to collect log files, click streams, big data analytics, and the more skilled we get at doing that, I think the more valid and the more secure our test will be. So those are my summary observations and predictions, and I had a little more to say, but I'm going to stop there. I'll just summarize what I had on my last slides. So we're changing what we measure, and we're moving from traditional domains of reading, writing, mathematics to more complicated constructs, 21st century skills, communication, collaboration, okay? These more complex skills require a lot more rigorous definitions, new methodologies, and new analytical methods. So ETS, I mean, this is the excitement of working at ETS, is that we're trying to make valid, authentic assessments of more complicated aspects of learning, teaching, communicating, collaborating. We're also changing how we collect those data. We use an evidence-centered design approach, and we talk about the validity arguments, and we talk about the theory of action. So we have a very logical, organized way to say, are these pieces of evidence valid indicators of our claims? Are our claims having the intended effects and in terms of washback and consequences? And so we look not just at psychometric reliability and validity, but the measurement usefulness of the construct and the outcomes. And lastly, the way we report data is changing. We want to have data reports that are interactive and deep, so that if you go onto a website, you don't get a score, you get some deeper analyses of what your score means, the strengths, the weaknesses, the patterns, the resources to get better at the things you didn't score well on. So we want to provide not just a score report, but a very helpful, formative, supportive report to you, the test taker, about strengths and weaknesses. So what we measure, how we measure, what we report are all changing, and hopefully what we do and these 10 global trends will increase the validity and the usefulness of our future assessments. So thank you very much.
All I can say is, wow. I mean, for 1 hour, everything that you thought you knew, that now you know you don't know, and that we're expecting both, I think, to use a word you used at the end, Scott, which is the excitement associated with this, maybe even the fear, as you mentioned it a couple of times, that this is the future that's just waiting to happen and almost right next door. It's really very impressive. Raises all kinds of questions, I'm sure, for many of us. The way we are operating today is we actually have asked 4 students to quickly, in a row, ask you several questions, then we open it up to everybody. But those 4, I think we can start here, and then others will, who has questions? 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, let's start at this side. Maybe just say your name and then your question.
Well, thank you first. Thank you so much for spending this afternoon with us. My name is Ara. So at the beginning of your speech, you said that economics is a zero-sum game, but education is not. And then you go on to kind of make a call for new pedagogies in education. And my question is, if those new pedagogies are still kind of rooted and justified through economics, through human capital theory, how is education not as at risk of being a zero-sum game with economics still at the core of it?
Ooh, okay.
So hold on. So we're going to take 4 in a row. We'll see if you can integrate them.
Oh, no, there's no way I'll be able to even remember them.
Okay,
Okay, thank you. My name is Irene.
I'll remember for you.
I'm from Venezuela. And I mean, it's no mystery that testing has become a very profitable industry. And ETS, even though it's a nonprofit organization, owns Prometric, which is, you know, profit, right? And they're the ones who administer the tests. So you addressed some of the issues with standardized testing. I wanted to ask you about a specific one. ETS mission on their website says it's to advance quality and equity in education. Now, when there are costs attached to these tests, like the GRE, for example, and that if you can take it as many times, like 12 times in a year, if you have the money to pay $160 every month, if you do poorly the first time you take it, I mean, that's inherently biased. So how do you deal with that, you know, a cost issue?
People who have more money. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Felix?
Hi, my name is Felix. One of my questions is related to the global trend when it comes to English as one of the most useful languages. Do you think it will have like a really negative impact to a monolingual country? Let's say, for example, to the people who study other languages like Spanish, Japanese, also they are becoming like really strong languages. So what will happen then with the study of these languages?
Okay.
What would happen with the study of those languages?
Like, we
Okay,
have like a negative motivation to study this now.
got it.
The push for English. Hina?
Yeah, I'm Hina Bullock. I'm from Pakistan. And
From
my
where?
question- From Pakistan.
Okay.
Yeah. My question is related to Irane's question. She talks to you about the cost part of these tests being more inaccessible. And I would like to ask you, as a victim of standardized testing, that kept me away from applying for higher education for many years abroad, I would like to ask you that for a lot of us from developing countries, we're not used to this testing format. We've never given any form of a standardized test in our lives. So for us, just the idea of giving the GRE or TOEFL is very, very nerve-wracking. So as a result, many of the scholarships that come through US government or XYZ government, a lot of the students from developing countries cannot access that because they're worried about GRE and TOEFL. And I think what happens in the end is that all of these scholarships eventually go to the rich students in these countries. So it kind of increases the income inequality over a period of time. How would you address that?
Okay, I see the theme. Okay, well, tough questions. Let me try, see if I can integrate an answer across. So, in general, the cost of some test is seen as biased or discriminatory for students who don't have the income or come from developing countries. I'll get to the other point about bias of unfamiliarity. But so there's an economic disparity in the cost of the test and the access to the testing and the training. I think that that's absolutely true. I think that it's unfortunate. I don't know if it's correctable. Okay? So I think that it would take some very innovative financial approaches So for example, in ETS, the price of the testing is actually moderated by the country. So the TOEFL exam costs a lot more in some countries than others, based on sort of the mean income level in the country. So ETS does try and adjust for differences across countries in terms of cost, but I recognize it's still very expensive. And the same with the GRE. I don't think that that's easily solved, because the people who create the test still have the expense of making it. And they can distribute the cost proportionally, but if it costs X percent of an American weekly wage and X percent of a Pakistani weekly wage, that's as fair as we might get, but it's still going to be a hefty sum. It's a little bit like the cost of drugs or the cost of college tuition. You can't make it free for everyone. You can't make it free for some people. The best, perhaps the equitable way, is to make it proportional in some sense to the person bearing the cost. Okay? This is a very tough question to answer on my feet. I'm trained as a researcher, not an economist or a banker, but I think you're pointing out a liability of global testing or global education. And I guess my own bias is that money always buys you a better education in every country in the world. I don't think that's been solved by anybody. And so, and we could go into the ramifications of that, but is it biased against people with less income? Education, I think, unfortunately, is biased against people who have less education. ETS's website says our mission is to encourage equity and quality, to promote it. And that is our mission. And I've been very pleasantly surprised to find out that that's not something that is a slogan. Actually, everybody at ETS believes that deeply, from the CEO right through every single worker. And I've seen many discussions where people say, we're not going to make any money, or we're going to lose money on this. And people say, it's important for the mission, it's okay. This is, in fact, we even have some discussions that says, this is a mission-driven product. We're not even going to think about profit and loss on it, because we want to do it, we need to do it. Which is, it's part of the benefit of a nonprofit. We can do things that are true to our mission that the company believes in. And whether it's adjustable pricing or whether it's creating assessments that we know aren't going to make money. I mean, for example, the K-12 market in America has got a very slim margin and a huge competition. If we were making business decisions, nobody would get into the K-12 market. There's so many better revenue streams in other markets. But it's our mission, and I've heard these discussions at ETS, it's our mission to help improve K-12 education, regardless if we're going to make money from it.
Scott, couldn't I add right there, because there's a, I believe, I could be wrong, but I think at the origins of ETS, going all the way back, wasn't it a consequence of Harvard University's attempt by the former president of Harvard to achieve more equity? They were finding that you had to be a rich person's son to get into Harvard, and they wanted to have more women, more people from other groups. So they created this standardized assessment.
Right.
So, but if you fast forward to your slides, that early mission, and I think that what I'm hearing, these are competing principles. I mean, you still have that, it sounds like that early mission to provide equity, but some of these tests look like they might be driving in the other direction because of the very nature of inequities in the world around us. Some people have more money, some people have more access to standardized tests, some people have more access to English, their parents speak English as opposed to them having to learn as a second language. The questions largely revolve around that that contrast.
Okay, and thank you for making that point. The original goal for ETS was, in fact, to counter selection bias in higher education. And so the SAT, we partnered with College Board from the beginning. The SAT was designed to be an assessment that would, quote, level the playing field, that it would be independent of wealth and background of the test taker. And that is still our commitment, to try and improve equity. Now, I think you're raising interesting challenges. If we create new tests that are unaffordable for people, does that contribute to inequity? Yes, it could. Our job would be to try and minimize that. I mean, I'd be very happy to take back your suggestions. Adjustable pricing is the one thing we do. There may be additional suggestions. Let me see if I can come back to a couple of the other questions. So I don't think we want to prioritize English language as a global language. You know, there more people speak Chinese than English, and so you don't want to have frequency or wealth or business or something be a sole determiner of language. I think every language for every population has critical functions and purposes, and I wouldn't want to de-emphasize or deprioritize a native language because most business is conducted in some other language. I think for any citizen in any country, the question is, what tools are going to serve you well in what you want to do? A lot of people never leave their home country and don't have much reason to learn another language. I mean, certainly that's Americans' excuse for not learning other languages. So the exigencies of where you live and what you're going to do will say whether you need to learn a particular language. But I think we don't want a colonial attitude about English. So the fact that it is the de facto lingua franca of business now doesn't lessen the importance of other languages. I think from if you look at global trends in assessment, which was my assignment today, I think the importance of English continues to grow because of the shrinking globalization of the world and because of more people conducting business through English-speaking institutions. So people that want to participate in that global kind of economy or education, it's beneficial to learn English. But it shouldn't deprioritize or devalue any other language. The original question that you asked about zero-sum game, it was my metaphor that when I look at the global economies, I worry that somebody's gain is somebody else's loss. And the current situation now where we are so globally interconnected, you know, if the price of gasoline goes down, then it affects, the ripple effect is through the entire world and the industry. On the other hand, education seems to me to be a different metaphor, and that is that everyone can gain by having greater human capital and more knowledge. So to the extent that every nation has 10% more of its population complete high school, that seems to me that everybody in the world gains, no one loses. So that if an undeveloped nation increases its literacy rate, it doesn't disadvantage someone else. If Obama is correct and we can encourage a higher rate of high school and post-secondary graduation, that should benefit our country as well as the rest of the world. So that's what I meant to say, is that education and the production of human capital can be a global benefit. It can be, to me, that's still why education is a noble enterprise, is that it brings good things to individuals and to societies. So to the extent that we can help it, I think it's great. I've been surprised since I've taken the job at ETS, that ETS has a commitment to do good for societies, not just America, but globally. And that the commitment that everyone shares is that if we make better tests, we can help teachers and we can help students. It's the single thing that resonates across all the employees at ETS is that we all think we're doing something that can be helpful. You know, it's not like, not like the university where I'm trying to get more publications and grants so I can get a better office and more sabbaticals. And it's not an individual enterprise. You know, I'm sorry, I spent 39 years in academics, and academics is about mostly individuals. A few people are different, but it's a lot about individual achievement. And at ETS, we rarely have anything that's done by individuals. Everything is team-driven and collaborative, and everybody celebrates those successes. The difference in environment is huge for me. And that's why, again, back to the theme of the questions about sort of economics of education, I wanted to emphasize that assessments in education can increase our human capital. I don't want to think it increases disparities. I would work against things that create inequities and disparities in opportunity. I think the questions about even something as simple as it cost me more to take the TOEFL test 3 or 4 times, and some people can afford that better than others, that's a really tough issue because we want to encourage the learning that hopefully is going along with multiple testing, but we don't want to disadvantage a person who has difficulty paying for it.
Okay, so that's terrific. We do have time for a few more questions. I'd like to sort of open it up more generally. I'll take several more questions from others. 1, 2, 3, who had to ask before. So in that order, where was I? Were you one?
No,
The revenue stream.
Oh, sorry.
Oh,
Sure.
back there.
Sorry. Introduce yourself quickly and keep the question short.
My name is Ruchira Goswami, second year International Education Development Program student. I love the presentation and the ideas.
Thank you.
I love the presentation and the ideas, especially the ideas that would roll out in the future. But my question is that the intention to develop any assessment tool is to predict a certain kind of behavior. So when you're developing assessment tools related to 21st century skills, I wonder the behavior would serve as a predictor for an organization that would be employing the students or for the higher education institutions.
Either.
So in a way, I wonder who would be the purchaser of those tests.
Okay, good question. Let's take collaboration as an
How
example.
about collaborate? What if I take a few other questions to make sure we get into it? Because otherwise, this is teamwork. We've
a
been working
memory
as a team
load.
for a long time. It's a performance test. Yeah.
Hi,
Hi.
my name is Lily. I'm a first-year IEDP student. I'm also a Dr. Rebecca's student. Thank you so much. It's really informative. So my question is, do you or does CTS always want to ensure consistency in different levels of exams? So for example, if a student is performing not so well during high school on SAT, is there any chance that he's gonna be perform better on a GRE? And if there's consistency within the testing system, do you consider that students who normally are not considered effective students, are they gonna be totally disadvantaged for the rest of their life? Because it sounds like it.
Good question.
Thank you.
I'm Liza Herzog. I'm Director of Research and Evaluation for the Philadelphia Education Fund, and I'm a past grad school ed student, doctoral student here. Question is, the next-gen science standards look to marry the cross-cutting concepts, the core ideas, and the science and engineering practices. So does ETS, and you mentioned attention given to both students and teachers, the delivery of these standards are as good as is the teacher's kind of knowledge and, ability to deliver this combination of things that I know Achieve and others are working to kind of create rubrics around. Pennsylvania's not even an adoptee of the standards yet. In your mind, how does ETS really pay, how do you handle the teacher education vis-a-vis the student uptake of that information in these new ways that are demanded by these standards?
Okay, boy. Okay.
And you have.
Okay, so very difficult questions. I don't see the theme, so I'll try and answer them sequentially. Who is going to be the recipient of the knowledge? So the collaborative problem solving or 21st century skills are going to be important for either the workplace or the higher education institution. So I can imagine if I'm, well, let's take graduate school. If I'm a graduate school admissions person and I'm looking at credentials and I happen to see some stackable credentials that say you're good at teamwork and collaboration and civic education and critical thinking, in addition to being from top university with a high GPA, I have a little more confidence that you're going to fit in to my system that needs teamwork and collaboration. If I'm an employer and you're applying for a job and I know that you're going to work with a team of people, it would be nice to have some extra validation that you're good at those kinds of skills. So either an employer or an academic institution could be the recipient of that information. Now, and we're not trying to make this up on our own. This is what people tell us. So what we hear from higher education institutions in the workforce is, I need more information about the job relevant skills and the 21st century skills of the people that apply. I think graduate schools would do a lot better than looking at GRE scores and GPA and alma mater. I mean, I looked at that for a long time. Those don't tell you nearly as much about a person as the other characteristics. So I think we'd like to measure those other characteristics. Okay? So, and then I want to connect that a little bit to this question about sort of the longitudinal nature. If you don't do well on SAT, how am I going to do on the GRE? We're developmental psychologists, and so we know that there is something stable. You can call it G or whatever, but a fair amount of the variance of your test scores are your general mental abilities. And those have some stability. Now, depending on the circumstances, if your circumstances and context change tremendously, then in fact you have opportunities to increase or decrease your general mental abilities. So take, for example, someone who's been in a rural countryside school, has poor teachers, didn't learn very much, and at age 12 ends up in an urban environment with good teachers, and you might see a tremendous change in test scores. But if the environment stays the same when you take the SAT and when you take the GRE, I'm going to bet that the scores are going to be pretty well predicted. So, if your environment doesn't change, it's your individual characteristics that are going to carry the variance. So they are predictive. SATs do predict GREs. Of course, the interesting thing is SATs and GREs do not predict your professional success, your life happiness, or your income, or anything else that you might want to value. So academic predictors based on literacy, numeracy, critical reasoning kinds of skills predict other academic measures. So let's not fool ourselves that somehow if you're not good at the SAT or GRE, you're not good at something. You can be terrific at a whole lot of things. Okay, is that fair? Okay, and then the hard question about how you connect teaching and students, and the shift that I see is that assessments are things we gave to students, we did to students. You have to pass this test at the end of the term, or it's a gateway, it's a bar. The metaphors for assessment are all sort of oppressive, and the load is on students. And it seems to me that people are saying that's not a useful function for assessments. That if you're going to ask somebody to meet a level of performance, you need to provide the support. And if they've missed that level, you need to provide the support so that, not that everyone has to jump the same bar, but there has to be some support for the performance that's measured. And we talk about it as formative assessment. I see it as almost a revolutionary approach in the classroom. It places the responsibility on teachers to say, I'm giving you this assessment so I can help you better, not so I can sort you or give you a mark or categorize you. I'm not doing this so I can say you're an A or a B or a C. I'm doing this so I know how I can provide better teaching materials so you can go even further. Whether you're here or here, you want to go further. And so that's a tremendous burden on teachers to be that smart to diagnose all those kids in the classrooms and help every single one of them. So I think the technology approaches to individualized tutoring, personalized learning, diagnostic assessment, formative assessment, all of those approaches basically embody the notion that teachers need more help, not just measuring where students are at, but promoting them to learn more. And so that the learning and assessment get connected, I hope, better than ever before. I wrote papers and did research on how standardized testing can be misunderstood by parents and can hurt kids. So it's a bit of an anomaly that I'm working for an assessment company, but I really believe that the goal of ETS is to improve teachers' ability to provide more opportunities for students to achieve. And all of these changes to assessments, I think, are so much richer than multiple choice tests. I can tell you stories. I gave multiple choice tests to students who couldn't speak English as a first language, and I knew they knew the material. They knew they knew the material. Actually, there's a guy named Hefir Ben Benudi, who's a professor at NYU. He was in my class and he failed my first exam. And he said, I know this stuff. So I said, okay, after the next exam, just let everybody go, and then you put a question mark by any question you want to talk about, and I'll talk about it. And he went through the entire exam, and it was so clear that the grammar of the multiple choice items tripped him up. He didn't understand it. He knew the material, every single one he knew. And so we did that the rest of the semester. He got an A in the class, okay, because he was a smart guy. But if I'd gone by his test scores, he would have been in trouble. And so we instituted that for everybody else. And so I know that assessment can be discriminatory and unfair if it's done badly. And I did it badly because I used traditional multiple choice tests that came with the item banks, that came with the textbooks. But if you individualize it to allow people to show what they know and what they can do, get over the language barriers, get over anything else that's in the way of them demonstrating, then assessment does provide equity. And I think that's what we're trying to do with these trends, is say, how can I have better assessments, more authentic, more valid, more opportunities for students to show what they know. So I think that's a good goal. I hope we get there.
Well, this has just been, I think, a tour de force. I think for those of us who are interested in these questions, we're going to have to stop now. I just want to maybe end, before I say thank you and we give you a big round of applause, I just want to say that this is a topic I think that all of us have gone through, all of us think about the trends for the future. I think what's fascinating, I'd like just to comment just for a second on your comment about both university life or academic life and life in a think tank or nonprofit such as ETS. It is, I think, incredibly helpful for us to hear about the kind of work that you're doing and with the commitment that you have. We've been in touch for many years, but it's very interesting, it's very interesting to hear sort of your approach and what your team or teams are doing at ETS. I could say more, but we will have to run to another engagement ourselves, but I think we give Scott Paris a big round of applause.
Thank you.